Cradle of Horror presents The Landlady. It's not that Margaret truly believed that her landlady was going to kill her. It's that she felt that her landlady maybe hoped Margaret would just die on her own. Or maybe not even that. Maybe she just dreamed that Margaret would die. Or maybe Margaret was just being paranoid. Regardless, Margaret never felt secure in her apartment. Her landlady seemed to cause problems for her since she moved in 8 months ago. But the rent was cheap. The neighborhood was nice and close enough to what she needed. And she needed something quickly, since she had just separated from her husband. Margaret hadn't been the breadwinner in her former relationship. While they were married, this wasn't an issue. However, it suddenly was an issue in her divorce. Nervous that when the divorce was finalized, she wouldn't be able to afford rent, Margaret was willing to secure the cheapest apartment that wasn't completely falling apart. The landlady started out as friendly enough, but there was always something off about her. Margaret chalked it up to her being a little bit older, or even thought she just had some funny personality quirk. Sometimes Margaret would come home to her landlady hovering around her apartment door. Margaret couldn't tell if the landlady was coming or going, but she always seemed to have some flimsy excuse for being there. Once, after such an encounter with her landlady, Margaret could have sworn a few items had moved around her kitchen. She shrugged it off at the time. Margaret concluded that she was being paranoid at the thought of her landlady entering her apartment, especially since it seemed that if she had entered, she only moved things around. Margaret had left her expensive jewelry and a small stack of $20 bills out that hadn't been touched at all. It didn't make sense. Margaret figured she was just adjusting to her new life. The problems, however, started a few weeks after she moved in. There seemed to be ongoing construction in the basement. Sounds of drilling, digging, and other tools rang in Margaret's head from early in the morning until late at night. After 1 month of this, Margaret called her landlady, asking when she could expect the construction to be over. The landlady always had a different answer. Sometimes it was in a couple of weeks, sometimes it was in a couple of months, but the construction never stopped. The construction workers were equally as vague. They could never really explain what they were doing. Every day they worked on something else. They also seemed nervous when Margaret would inquire about their work. Margaret realized that this bothered them when the landlady contacted her and asked her to not disturb the workers. The landlady told Margaret that her many interruptions were causing the workers to fall behind, and, therefore, the work would take longer. This was, obviously, frustrating to Margaret, who was getting daily headaches from the constant noise from the basement. So, Margaret stopped asking questions. Margaret was curious as to how her neighbors were dealing with all the noise and disruption. She figured she'd see someone around, maybe at the mailbox or coming and going. But she only saw someone once. He had a very distinct beauty mark on his face, which Margaret noticed right away because she'd lasered off most of her distinct marks over the years. It was right after Margaret moved in, and she wasn't feeling very social, so she didn't even say hi. She just wanted to be left alone. She did remember thinking that the neighbor didn't seem to want any attention either. He looked upset, tired, and a little stressed. Margaret figured this was the apartment building where people moved when they were going through a bad time in their life. Margaret told herself that once she felt better, she'd talk to him the next time they crossed paths. After 8 months without an end to the construction in sight, Margaret decided that this was just her fate, and she learned to become accustomed to the noise. But that's when the smell started. The smell wasn't so offensive at the beginning. Initially, there was just a faint smell of sawdust. Margaret tried not to let it bother her. She was worried that one more email would cause her landlady to evict her, and with freelance writing jobs few and far between, she didn't want to make her living situation more precarious. So, under these circumstances, Margaret thought a little sawdust smell would be fine. The sawdust smell, however, changed to something far worse. It was a smell that seemed to fill her nostrils with a vengeance. A smell that made her stomach turn, caused her nose to run, and made her cough until she vomited. She hadn't experienced anything quite like it before. Margaret looked outside for anything that caused the smell, but ultimately, she determined that it wasn't coming from outside the building. Margaret tried to ignore the issues by focusing on building her freelance career. When she was married, Margaret had the luxury of taking on whatever projects interested her. She didn't worry so much about how they paid, how long they took to complete, or even working on a set schedule. She would only take on gigs that she found interesting and exciting. She didn't get many opportunities this way, especially since Margaret wasn't really working hard to get more work. But she was happy with the arrangement. That changed the minute she left her husband's home. And it really was his home. He purchased it before they even met. It was a 3-story townhouse right downtown. Margaret used to love living in the middle of the action. She thought it was pretty hip to be around all the comings and goings. She loved just walking around, seeing what was going on, and participating whenever she felt like it. Her situation was very calm and very pleasant. Her husband would often comment on how easily she navigated through life. She initially thought the remark was a compliment, but as their relationship disintegrated, she realized that he was resentful of how easy her life was. He felt that he did all the work to give Margaret an easy life, but his life wasn't easy at all. He worked day and night, according to him. He was at the office at all hours, and everything he did he felt his wife didn't appreciate. Margaret wanted to be a writer, but her husband never felt that she was a very good writer. While Margaret claimed that she only accepted jobs that inspired her, her husband felt that she simply wasn't capable or interested in more challenging tasks. He read her writing once, and while he tried to find something kind to say to her, they both knew he was searching. She wasn't going to be the next New York Times bestseller, he thought. That was the moment that Margaret knew something was wrong. But she didn't say anything, and neither did her husband. They both knew it was over. Unfortunately, neither Margaret nor her husband made any attempts to make things better. Margaret wanted to maintain her lifestyle. She wanted cleaners to come every couple of days. She wanted a new car, and she didn't want all that to go away. What Margaret wouldn't do for cleaners to help her out now? Her apartment was small, but cleaning it frustrated her. She couldn't believe how far she had fallen. She went from having anything and everything that she could possibly want to feeling as though she couldn't even tell her landlady that her apartment smelled like sawdust, or whatever the viler mystery smell was. Margaret almost told her landlady when one day the smell worsened. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. The smell was awful, and the only way Margaret could describe it was as though something was rotting. She couldn't tell if an animal died in the vent somewhere, or in the construction, but something was decomposing. Sometimes Margaret would take a deep breath, plug her nose, and hold it just to get a break from the smell. She could never identify what the rotting smell was, and she was too nervous to tell her landlady, or to even ask the workers. However, It turns out that the smell wasn't the worst of it. Margaret had moved in during the summer months, so she didn't know how the winters would be. The first few weeks of the cold weather seemed fine. Margaret remembered thinking that the heaters were nice and warm, and even as the temperatures dropped outside, she knew that she would be cozy inside. That is, until she woke up in the middle of the night, shivering. When she touched the heater, it was freezing cold. Margaret panicked. She didn't know what to do. She didn't want to write her landlady. She didn't want to annoy her, but she was so worried about how cold it became. It was the coldest night of the year, a bad night for the heater to stop working. Margaret decided she could, at the very least, send a kindly worded email. That would be much more polite than calling her in the middle of the night. But the landlady wouldn't read that email until the morning. So, to survive the night, Margaret decided to use some extra blankets. Margaret typed the email from her bed. She shivered as she wrote, "I'm sorry to write to you in the middle of the night, but it seems that the heater in my apartment isn't working. I don't mean to disturb you, but if that could be fixed tomorrow, I would greatly appreciate it." Margaret felt that it was the best way to deal with the issue. The email was professional and understanding. Margaret went to sleep under a pile of blankets, but she felt somewhat convinced that the issue would be resolved the next morning. Unfortunately, the landlady wasn't so understanding. She didn't reply to Margaret's email and didn't even try to contact her the next day. Margaret had another cold sleep that night, which would have been bad enough, except that this is the night that the rotting smell decided to become almost intolerable. Margaret decided that she would have to call the landlady the next day. She didn't want to. She didn't want to anger her, but there was no other option. The call went about as well as Margaret thought it would. The landlady first accused Margaret of tampering with the heater and causing it to break. Margaret tried and tried to convince her that she didn't do anything to break the heater, but nothing seemed to work. And on top of that, the landlady was offended at the thought that there was something rotting in the basement. Margaret tried over and over again to explain that she doesn't think something is actually rotting in the basement, just that it smells like it. Basically, the call didn't get her anywhere. Margaret laid in bed that night, thinking about her old life. She thought about her Egyptian cotton sheets, her fireplace, and the lovely smell of incense that she had around the house. Margaret looked at the ceiling as tears flowed down her face. On the third day without the heater, and with the wafting smell of rot, Margaret knew she needed to do something. So, she decided she would go and work from a coffee shop for the day, just to get away from all the issues. She enjoyed working from the coffee shop much more than she anticipated. There were people around, but it wasn't an overwhelming noise like the construction. It was a white noise that she easily blocked out. She started to feel like this could be a good scenario for her. She could buy a medium tea and basically have an office for a few hours. Not bad for $2.50 a day. After spending most of the day at the coffee shop, Margaret felt accomplished. It had been the first day since leaving her husband that she felt as though she did something right. She felt good about herself. She wasn't keen to go back to her disaster of an apartment, but she was on a high following her productivity. She even had a bit of a smile on her face as she turned the corner onto her street. The smile faded as she saw a group of people surrounding a fire truck. As she approached, she saw that the fire truck was parked outside of her building. The firefighters didn't let her go in and wouldn't listen to her when she tried to clarify that she was a tenant of the building. Margaret watched their activity. She tried desperately to catch someone's eye, and then she noticed the firefighters in the window of her apartment. Margaret was worried. She couldn't understand why they were in her apartment. but she must have looked terrified because one of the firefighters approached her. She explained through tears that she lived in the building, and she was concerned that they were in her apartment. The firefighter let her through. Margaret ran inside and saw what all the fuss was about. In the middle of her living room, there was a huge black circle. Part of the couch had been burned, and a few other items were destroyed. When Margaret asked the firefighters how the fire started, they said it seemed like someone started the fire right on the spot. There was no sign of any electrical problems at all. When the police arrived, they questioned Margaret about where she'd been that day, and she told them she worked from a coffee shop. Although they didn't seem to believe her, Margaret told them there was probably security footage of her there all day. Margaret finally understood that they were trying to gauge if she was involved in the fire, and at that moment, Margaret believed that her landlady had something to do with it. As though her thoughts summoned her, Margaret's landlady walked into the apartment. Margaret looked at her. She tried to see if she would reveal any motive or sign that she was involved. The police updated her on the events of the day, and the landlady seemed to be learning everything for the first time. When the police asked the landlady if she could think of any reason that this happened, the landlady had the audacity to suggest that Margaret was involved. She cited Margaret's complaints regarding the heat, suggesting that Margaret started a fire to keep warm. Margaret looked at the police officers with a face that said, "You've got to be kidding me." The police officers also seemed to think it was far-fetched. Who could possibly suggest that she would light a fire in her own living room? The landlady was convinced about it, though. The police officer asked how cold the apartment was, but the landlady brought the officers to the heater to show that the heaters were warm. This made the police officers suspicious of Margaret. Margaret defended herself, but the officers didn't seem to care. They said they would launch an investigation, but there didn't seem to be enough evidence that would bring them to a solid conclusion. Everyone vacated the apartment, and Margaret was left standing there, looking at the giant black mark in the middle of the room. Margaret became nervous. She couldn't understand what could have possibly happened to cause a fire to start in her living room if her landlady wasn't involved. If she didn't do it herself, maybe she got someone else to do it. Margaret was tired of thinking about it and decided to take a shower. When she finished her shower, she realized that she was freezing cold. She initially thought that it was because she was still wet. When she still felt cold after a couple of hours, she went to feel the heater. They were turned off. Again. Her landlady was definitely doing something. Margaret just didn't know what it was. Was she trying to get Margaret to leave and break her lease? Was she trying to terrorize her? Margaret thought her darkest thought and wondered if her landlady was trying to kill her. Did she start the fire, hoping that Margaret would return when it was in progress and she would get hurt or stuck? Margaret tried to forget the idea as quickly as she thought it up. That's way too extreme. There's no way that her landlady would try to kill her. That evening, Margaret decided to try to speak with some of her neighbors. She knocked on every single apartment door, and not one tenant answered. She didn't even see the worried man with the beauty mark that she first saw when she moved in. Margaret certainly thought it was strange, and it was the first time since she moved in that she thought she would have to consider moving out. She didn't like the idea, but everything was getting so eerie. She didn't feel good about living in her apartment. And if she ended up having to pay more rent, she thought it would be worth it. The next morning, Margaret woke up because she could smell smoke. The smell became overwhelming, so much so that Margaret ran to the washroom to vomit. While she sat in front of her toilet, gagging, she began to realize that the rotting smell was stronger than it had ever been before. Between the smoke and the rotting smell, Margaret knew that something was wrong. Margaret decided she had to leave. She packed a backpack and threw in some clothes, toiletries, and her laptop. She then grabbed her jacket and ran out of her apartment. She didn't get far when she saw that the entrance to the building had a fire in front of it, blocking her exit. The only other option was down the stairs, through the basement, and out the back door. She ran downstairs, and the smell became unbearable. Margaret was finally able to confirm that the smell certainly came from the basement. There was no mistaking it now. When Margaret ran down the stairs and turned the corner, she saw what caused the smell. She saw corpses in the basement. Some were buried, some were semi-buried, and some were seemingly recently deceased corpses. It was horrifying, but it all became much worse when she noticed a half-covered face with a very distinct beauty mark. The man she saw when she moved in. It was him. Margaret finally connected the dots. He must have been going through then what she was dealing with now. Everything, the smell, the realization, her predicament, it all made Margaret vomit. She looked up again and saw the open back door and decided she would make a beeline for it. She wiped her mouth and started to run when 3 of the construction workers walked in through the open door. Without saying anything, Margaret could see that they were blocking her freedom. She turned around and saw her landlady standing in the staircase. Margaret looked back and forth. She didn't know how she'd be able to get out. She thought she'd have a better chance running by her landlady. But even if she did, when she got upstairs, there was a fire at the door. But there was no way she was going to get by the 3 construction workers. So she turned and ran towards her landlady. Margaret believed she could try to break a window to escape near the front door. Margaret ran by her landlady, and just as she thought she would make it, she felt a bolt of electricity in her side. Her landlady had a stun gun in her hand. Margaret fell on the stairs and was motionless. She couldn't move as she saw the 3 construction workers pick her up and start burying her in a shallow grave. Margaret started to move a little bit and was doing everything in her power to escape when she felt a needle go into her arm. Seconds later, she couldn't move any muscle in her body. She couldn't even blink. All she could do was watch as the dirt continued to cover her, more and more, until she couldn't see anything at all.